Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Ramsay Center for Western Civilization lecture series. My name is Martin Fahy. I'm the CEO of the Ramsay Center for Western Civilization. I'd love to extend a very warm welcome to all of you here to the Art Gallery New South Wales. I'm sure you'd agree that the gallery continues to be an amazing asset to the community. The recent extensions, the renovations here really do, I think, speak hugely to the commitment to art and culture that the City of Sydney and the State of New South Wales has had. I'd also like to recognise the board members of the Ramsay Centre who've joined us here today and thank them particularly for their support. And I think the most important thing we can do at these occasions is to recognise the role of Paul Ramsay and his legacy in making it possible for us to come together and to engage in informed, intelligent, civil conversation in the public square about matters of amazing importance. And so we pride ourselves on being able to bring together the best minds, the best unafraid, hard thinking. And tonight, I think, is an amazing example of bringing public intellectuals, an experienced journalist, a foreign relations correspondent, an advisor to important think tanks. Robert Kaplan's had an amazing career, a career that has been defined by a very deep and thoughtful contribution to public discourse and to the way we view the really hard issues that challenge us geopolitically and from a foreign affairs point of view around the world. He's written over 22 books. His next book is due out in January. But it's not just the quantity of his output, but the quality and depth and the manner in which it resonates. And resonates not just in the period in which it's written, but resonates decades later. For those of you who've read Balkan Ghosts, Imperial Grunts, The Tragic Mind, I suppose, reflects a continuation of that. And tonight, it's that most recent book, The Tragic Mind, that he's going to talk about. Robert's very often, I suppose, labelled as a pessimist. But Robert, I think, is very much somebody who says it's not about being optimistic or pessimistic, it's about being realistic. And I think he, more than anyone, has had a front row seat to the impossible choices that have characterised decision-making at the highest level over the last 20 years in geopolitics. And tonight, he's going to place that within the framework of Greek tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy, and the wider literary and Western canon, and argue that if we are to produce great leaders, if we are to make, difficult but important decisions, we have to recognize the omnipresence of tragedy. That in many cases, the choices that face leaders are not about, the cheerfulness of the redeeming resolution of the conflict, but very often a choice between two and picking the less worst outcome. Robert's been with us for the week. He's been incredibly generous. He's been incredibly humble. And I think it's that epistemological humility that really characterizes his work. In many occasions, the answers to the questions that are posed to him begin with him saying, well, it depends. And so tonight, he's going to share, I think, some very important views, perspectives drawn from his very, very long career, as I said, as a journalist. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Robert Kaplan.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Martin, so much for that very warm, lucid introduction to what I've been trying to accomplish over the past 40 years, actually. I've been a foreign correspondent for almost half a century, beginning in Cold War Eastern Europe in the 1980s. And up until the present. What I'd like to talk about tonight is to define what tragedy is and then to describe the world as it is now in Ukraine, the Middle East, Asia, the Asia Pacific, and why one needs a tragic mind in the way I interpret it in order to understand the difficult choices that leaders have. First of all, tragedy is not common misfortune. Common misfortune is the normal way of life that all human beings experience in the course of a lifetime. That's not what the Greeks meant when they discussed tragedy. Nor is tragedy vile violations of human rights, like the Holocaust, Rwanda, or whatever. The Greeks would have no answer for crimes of that scale. And that goes beyond tragedy. Tragedy is very human, but it's not, as I said, common misfortune. It's not fatalism. Being fatalistic does not mean you're tragic, and being tragic has nothing to do with fatalism. Tragedy is about comprehension. It's about comprehending how it's not good versus evil, because good versus evil are easy choices. Again, that's not what the ancient Greeks were concerned with. It's about one good versus another good that causes suffering. It's about and this goes back to the hard choices that leaders have to make. What is an example of one good versus another good that causes suffering? There are grave crises and human rights violations all over the world all the time. And in some cases, a great power could intervene for the good, and in other cases, it can't. Because if it intervened all the time, the policy would be unsustainable, and there would be a backlash on the home front. So it's a good to try to alleviate suffering overseas, but it's also good to pay attention to the responsibilities of a home front, because democratic voters have more of a hold on you. The people who elected you have more of a moral hold on you than people half a world away who don't. That's a very hard thing to say. And yet that is what tragedy is about, and that's what the Greeks meant, that it's one good versus another good, and the choice between the two goods where you can only choose one that causes suffering. And that leads to another profound realization of the ancient Greeks, which is that this world is beautiful even though it's highly imperfect. It's imperfect, yet it's beautiful at the same time. It's a contradiction. And the ancient Greeks were wise enough to live in contradictions. They would also say that human greatness is more apparent in disaster than in triumph. It's very easy to have a good outlook and a good attitude and a good personality when things are going well. That's very easy. That's not a sign of good character. But what's a sign? But how do we grow emotionally and intellectually? We grow emotionally and intellectually by the things we get wrong, by the things that humiliate us, by the mistakes that we make. That's when we really grow. The Greeks had had the greatest play about this. It's called Oedipus et Colonus by Sophocles. And imagine Oedipus, someone who murdered his father, had physical relations with his mother, all because he didn't know it, but yet he was guilty of it at the same time. And it made him so guilty that he blinded himself. He plucked his eyes out. And he wandered over the hills and valleys, blind, stooped over, accompanied by his daughter, and ended up at Colonus, a suburb of Athens. And what Sophocles is saying in this play is Oedipus achieved wisdom. because he had made the worst choices, because the worst things had happened to him. He was then the wisest man on earth and was therefore worthy of respect. As a personal note, I've met a number of American presidents and secretaries of state, but I never met Nixon. And I would have liked to have met Nixon, not while he was president, but after he was humiliated and driven from office because of Watergate. Nixon decided not to give speeches for money, even though he was in financial hardship. He decided to dedicate the rest of his life to writing serious books, not salacious tell-all books, Watergate from his side, books about health care, about foreign policy, etc. That was someone who had achieved a certain amount of wisdom, as the Greeks would interpret it. Tragedy particularly afflicts those in power, because the world is vast, but often the choices one makes have to be very narrow. A million things could be going on, but a leader is down to binary choices. And he doesn't know the outcome. The situation half a world away can be given to mysteries, uncertainties. Henry Kissinger once said that you have to act when 30% of the evidence is in, because by the time there's 40%, it's too late to do anything in the first place or to have any effect. So there's a certain amount of ignorance in action. And you only know part of the story, but you will make a decision on just part of the story, but be judged as if you knew the whole story. Decades later, people will judge you as if you knew everything that could happen. That's what makes leadership so difficult. There's another great play by Euripides about about the difficult choices facing leaders and why nobody should envy anybody in power, in supreme power. It's called Iphigenia at Aulis, and Euripides wrote it toward the end of his life. And it's not even clear he wrote it completely himself. He may have had a helper, or parts of it, may have been ghost written. It's unclear, but the story is very clear. It's about the obligations of the family versus the obligations of the state. You have this tribal leader of the Greeks, Agamemnon, and his military forces, his navy, are stuck at Evia, at Aulis, about to embark on the invasion of Troy. But there are no winds. And the soothsayers tell him there are no winds because you have offended the gods. And in order to get back into the gods' good graces, you have to sacrifice your daughter. Literally, physically sacrifice your daughter. And if you don't sacrifice your daughter, the men will revolt and they'll kill you and your family. And your daughter, of course, so that Agamemnon faces this horrible choice. He envies the common soldier who has no responsibilities. Everyone looks up to him as the great tribal king, but he's absolutely torn apart and in complete distress because officially he has all the power, but actually he has none. He has to make a binary choice, sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia and go on to sail to Troy and earn a great victory, or not to sacrifice her and be destroyed and be a traitor to Greece. It was a binary choice. And war, as I said, is often binary, to invade or not to invade. People say that there are wars of choice and wars of necessity. But I can tell you, all wars seem like wars of necessity when you have to make a choice whether to invade or not. It's only in hindsight that wars become war, that a war that's gone badly becomes a war of choice. It's not that clear originally. So tragedy is also the need for anxious foresight or constructive pessimism, to think about all the things that could possibly go wrong before you make a decision to act. One of the greatest progenitors of this idea were the founders of the American Revolution. Washington, Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, etc. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote a series of essays known through posterity as the Federalist Papers, where they argued about how a polity, how a government should be constructed. And it's an exercise in relentless pessimism. You never met more sourpuss, pessimistic men in all your life as the founders of the American Revolution. This could go wrong, what do we do? But that could go wrong, what can we do? Men are rapacious, vindictive, not to be trusted. All men are selfish. How do you design a form of government that takes into account the selfishness and the aggressiveness of man? I often say that America has historically been a country of optimism because it had the good fortune of being founded by pessimists. And because it was founded by pessimists, all the things that they worried about did not go wrong. It was other things that went wrong. Civil war had to be fought 70 years later. Other things went wrong. But generally, the Federalist Papers of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, which go right back to the ancient Greeks, because remember, these were men who read Machiavelli. They read Thomas Hobbes. And who had influenced Machiavelli and Hobbes the most? The ancient Greeks. And so these were the real founders of the American system. The Greeks, the greatest fear of the Greeks was anarchy. The Greeks were too rational to ignore the power of the irrational that lay on the other side of civilization. And by anarchy, I don't mean what's in the headlines every day. Anarchy and chaos are the most overused words in the media you could find. If there's an argument in Parliament that goes on for 5 minutes too long, people say there's anarchy in Parliament. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a place where no place rules, where nobody rules, where there is no government, essentially. Iraq, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, for a few years was a place of anarchy. I'm talking, many countries in the world, you drive outside the capital city and the government no longer has any writ. And there are armed men with assault rifles and with the safeties off, controlling roadblocks because there is no government. That's what I mean by anarchy, and that's what the ancient Greeks meant as well. They feared anarchy, and they feared it so much they invented a god who represented anarchy, Dionysus, who is the god of license, ecstasy, romance. Realists are romantics, because romance is a very irrational thing, and realists understand the power of the irrational. So it's not hard to find people who are very realistic and romantic at the same time. Our elites fear the wrong thing. They fear autocracy. But the deeper thing they should fear is chaos and anarchy. Because there's something worse than autocracy. It's nobody being in power at all. Now, that doesn't hold true in every single case. We can all think of examples of tyranny that were so awful, so obvious, you could say, what's worse? What's worse than this? Fine, we'll have some anarchy. At least it alleviates this. But generally speaking, anarchy, chaos are much worse than than tyranny. And the best example of this that I could think of is a conversation I had with, in Saudi Arabia with somebody close to the regime there, close to the government. And he said, look, we've seen your experiments in democracy in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen. It all either resulted in absolute chaos and vast violence, or regimes that were even worse, or regimes that were worse, or something so anarchic it slid back into autocracy, like in Tunisia recently. So leave us alone with your lectures about democracy, this Saudi told me. Look at us. We've had about 7 or 8 changes of regime over the last 100 years. Each one peaceful, each change lasting that took place within 24 hours. We once had a king assassinated in 1975. There was a new leader within 24 hours. It's autocratic, it's not democratic, but it's stable, it's not anarchic, it's efficient, technocratic government, and there's basically a social contract between ruler and ruled. The Greeks would smile at this. The Greeks, the inventors of democracy, understood this perfectly. And then there is, there was a great American writer of the 19th century, Herman Melville, who's famous for his book Moby Dick. But the last book that Melville wrote in his life was called Billy Budd, the name of a sailor. And Billy Budd was a youthful, handsome, peaceful sailor who had a stutter. He couldn't talk properly. And he was being bullied by a fellow shipmate. And so, unable to answer back with words because of his stutter, Billy Budd punches him hard and kills the man. And as a result, because this is a warship at war on the high seas in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, Billy Budd is hung. He is executed and hung. And Melville is very unhappy with this. He cries at the injustice of having to execute Billy Budd. The author cries at the injustice. There's almost a Christ-like impression of Billy Budd, but yet Melville sanctions it and explains to the reader why it's necessary in order to keep peace on the ship at the time of war. And Albert Camus, the French existentialist philosopher, wrote about this in his book Rebel. He said it's not enough. He said all men are rebels at heart. That there's always been rising up rebellions against oppressive regimes, but that's not enough, Camus said. Going back to the ancient Greeks, he said, you only have the moral right to rebel if you can erect a better order in its place than the one that exists. You have to have a plan, in other words, for the day after. You can't just to rebel. So that's the ancient Greeks. Let me apply this and go around the world now to see what we're facing around the world. Let me give you 2 concepts. There was a great Hungarian-American mathematician and intellectual of the mid-20th century who worked on the Manhattan Project, who developed the atomic bomb, also spoke ancient Greek. His name was John von Neumann. And von Neumann had a very interesting concept. He said, because technology will increasingly shrink the earth, shrink geography, he foresaw a time in decades hence when there would be overlapping missile ranges, ballistic missile ranges, spanning the circumference of the globe. That at a time of, as the Earth becomes more interconnected, the very finite, that's the word he used, the the very finite or limited size of the Earth will gradually become a force for instability. More and more people on the planet living in higher and higher urban concentrations, tied together by weaponry and cyber, where there's no place to escape to, so that we inhabit a more claustrophobic, anxious, difficult world. And difficult because while cyber technology is a plus in the financial world, in medical sciences, in many other things we can all talk about, it's a distinctly negative thing when it comes to geopolitics. Because it means that a crisis, a military crisis in one part of the earth, can spread to another part of the earth, can ricochet around the earth, so that we feel events half a world away to a much greater degree than we did 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. And he said, as he kept repeating, the very finite size of the earth will become the greatest force of instability. So keep that in mind. Then there's another phrase which has been popularized. It's been ascribed to Vladimir Lenin, but it's unclear that Lenin ever actually said it. Anyway, it's a great line. And the phrase is this. He said, decades could go on and nothing happens. Nothing much happens of consequence. Then days and weeks go on and decades happen. And we've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen it in the Middle East since October 7th. We see it in other places. So you put decades happening in a space of days, weeks, and months together with the very limited size of the earth, and you see a world that can only best be where leaders have to make the kind of split-second decisions that are so difficult, where there are no right choices, that it would engender the sympathy of the ancient Greeks. Let me start with Ukraine. Again, decades went along and not much happened. The Soviet Union collapsed into semi-anarchy. Gradually, Vladimir Putin arrested the anarchy through intelligence operations, his own repression, etc. He invaded parts of Ukraine in 2014. It energized the elites, but not the general public. And then in February 2022, decades started happening when he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the greatest military action in Europe since the Battle of Berlin in 1945, against which the military conflicts in the Balkans, with all of their horror, paled into insignificance, because that was dealing with minor powers without nuclear weapons. We weren't talking about multiple tank divisions, bombing apartment buildings in great cities, etc. I think what we're seeing is the Russians are on top for the moment, but I think we're seeing something deeper. I think we're seeing the beginning of the decline of the Russian Empire. Remember, the Russian Empire extends 11 time zones, half the longitudes of the Earth. It includes the Caucasus, former Soviet Central Asia, Siberia, and even further away, the Russian Far East. And over the past 2.5 years, we've seen tens of thousands of Russian tanks destroyed, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops either killed or wounded. And the war has gone on for 2.5 years. Now, let's go back to World War I for a comparison. World War I changed the 20th century. It gave the 20th century a very tragic trajectory. Why did it do that? Because World War I went on for 4 long years. Had World War I ended at the Battle of the Marne 6 weeks after the war started, or had ended at the Battle of the Somme 2 years into the war, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Hohenzollern-Prussian Empire, the Ottoman Empire may not have collapsed. There probably would have been no Hitler and no World War II. It's because the war went on for 4 years that it changed the 20th century. So that every month that the Ukraine war goes on is very consequential, every extra month. I know it drifts down in the news, little by, because there's no novelty anymore. And the media loves novelty. It doesn't matter how consequential something is, but if it starts to lose novelty, it's not covered as much. But don't be fooled. It may not have novelty anymore, but it matters, because thousands of people are being killed, being bombed, etc. And it's weakening the Russian ability, the Russian financial and leadership attention wherewithal to deal with the Caucasus, with Central Asia, with Siberia, etc. There are places, Siberian republics within the Russian Empire, Tuva, Buryatia, Chechnya, Dagestan, exotic place names that people know very little about. But the young men in those republics are fighting and dying in Ukraine at a much faster rate than young men from Moscow and St. Petersburg, because it's been a policy of Putin's regime to try to the degree possible to keep the war away from the urban Russians, the urban ethnic Russians, because he's afraid of a revolt of some sort. These republics will have their revenge ultimately. The longer this war goes on. And it will change Europe. And yet there's something worse than a weakening Russian empire, which is a collapse. Russia is not as institutionalized as China. If Xi Jinping were to get ill tomorrow, the Chinese Standing Committee would immediately elect a new leader. There's a whole system, a whole institutionalized system in China. China, after all, is the inventor of bureaucracy 4,000 years ago. But Russia is weakly institutionalized, semi-anarchic. Around Putin are concentric circles of oligarchs, organized crime figures, others, all of whom are mad as heck about him for invading Ukraine in the first place, who thought it was a mistake. But what they fear worse is his own demise, because his own demise could lead Russia to become a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia, a place in semi-anarchy. And that's what I mean by bad choices. Because over the past 2.5 years, President Biden has had a difficult choice. He wants to arm Ukraine, but he doesn't want the Russians to use a tactical nuclear weapon, as a response. And he doesn't want Russia to collapse. So he's followed a policy that satisfies nobody and will get him attacked through prosperity no matter what happens. But these are the difficult choices that the Greeks would sympathize with. Now, at the moment, Europe is focused on Ukraine. Europe's biggest threat is Ukraine, an aggressive Russian empire, etc. But Europe in the 21st century will face other challenges. The world population is graying. It's getting older. Europe's population is graying. It's getting older. But there's a baby boom in Africa and in parts of the Middle East. At the beginning of the 21st century, there was 1 European for every 1 African. By the end of the 21st century, there will be 7 Africans for every 1 European. And so even if you calculate in successful African states that produce new middle classes, the very mix of new middle classes weak states in other parts of the African continent, and failed states, you're going to have steady migration into Europe, and especially from the Middle East. And this is going to fuel continued right-wing populism in Europe. Governments like in Spain and Portugal and Italy are not worried about Russia or Ukraine. Because of geography, they're focused on the migration-immigration challenge, for which there is no answer really. Urban populations are harder to govern. They require infrastructure, street lighting, garbage collection, police forces. They're much more complex. The world is becoming urbanized. Africa is becoming more urbanized. There's also climate change. And I don't mean, and by climate change, I don't just mean different weather patterns. I mean, lowering in the nutrient value of the soil, creating more deserts, increasingly lack of water to drink. All this is driving African farmers away from the hinterlands and into cities to live in slums, for which governments have no answers. A democratic government is overthrown in Niger. It's replaced by a military autocracy, but the military autocracy will have no answers either. And Niger is just one example for problems for which governments lack the capacity to deal. So if you put urbanization together with resource scarcity, climate change on a finite planet, all in places in close proximity to Europe, you will see the difficulties that Europe will face in the 21st century, and the hard choices that leaders will have. Let me shift to the Middle East for a moment. As I said, on October 7th, 2023, days and weeks started to go by and decades started to happen in that time frame. Why is that? Because for about a decade before October 7th, there was a paradigm. There was a basic conception that everybody shared, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Gulf Arabs, others, which is that the Palestinian problem was not going to cause instability, that all the Israelis had to do was go into Gaza twice a decade, into Lebanon twice a decade, and what they called it, mow the lawn. Reduce it from Hamas 5.0 to Hamas 2.0, and the problem would essentially be solved. All that blew up on October 7th. I'm not going to recount the history to you. It's been in the headlines, all of that. But I just want to tell you that there are no easy solutions for this. You could say, well, there needs to be a Palestinian state. Gaza was an independent de facto Palestinian state for 20 years. In 2005, the Israelis withdrew all of their troops. They uprooted and withdrew every Jewish settler, so that there was total self-rule. In addition, they allowed the Gazans to cross into Israel every morning, to work in Israel, and come back at night with hard currency. And they allowed aid to come in from Qatar and other places. And that didn't solve the problem. It didn't lead. You could imagine what Lee Kuan Yew could have done with Gaza in 2005. Instead of building tunnels, he would have he would have modernized the port and turned it into a big shipping mecca. And then you have the West Bank. If you look at a map of the West Bank, you see big, large ink blots of Jewish settlements. And you look at this map and you say, there's not going to be a solution to this. Because the purpose of the Jewish settlements was to create facts on the ground. over several decades, and make it impossible to eradicate them. So you have this situation where Hamas, Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, Hezbollah, they're essentially, why cannot they be eradicated? Because they're essentially employment agencies. They provide jobs, food, livelihood, a mission for unemployed young men in places with weak or non-existent economies. That's the fact. And because of that, there's no easy answer. I would say that there will be ceasefires, there will be, and there will be probably a return of many of the hostages, there will be. But essentially, the current dynamic of conflict between Israel, Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, will probably continue until there is some sort of a change of regime in Iran. Remember, the Cold War ended not because of an international development. It ended because of a domestic political development. Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union, and it collapsed around him, and that ended the Cold War. I would say that the Middle East will change when there is a domestic political development inside Iran, because Iran has been likened to a country ruled by a narrow clique of North Koreans over a country that are South Koreans, essentially. Iran is one of the most dynamic, open-minded places you can imagine. 85 million urbanized, highly educated Persians just waiting to burst forth into the global economy and being held down by a narrow, increasingly unstable regime. And when that regime changes or evolves, it will be a world historical event, just like when the Shah's regime changed. And it will change the Middle East in many ways. Let me talk a bit about Asia and US power. That American military power is not about nuclear weapons, even though America still has many of them. The reason is because nuclear weapons cannot be used. They're not designed to be used. They're designed for pressure, for national prestige, for intimidation, but they're not included in any Western military doctrine. What gives the United States military its primary power is the American Navy. A Navy, an aircraft carrier strike group contains enough destructive power to destroy a middle-sized city. And it can go around the world at will. The United States can decide to send an extra aircraft carrier strike group to the Eastern Mediterranean. There's almost no news coverage over it. It's not secret. It's just not a big news story. They move carrier strike groups around the world at will. You try to move 10,000 Army troops, 10,000 American soldiers from one part of the world to the other. The New York Times has an editorial about it. There's a big story about it. There's arguments on the talk shows about it. The Navy can do things that the Army cannot, essentially, and it does it all the time. And so you have to say the world we live in, the world of globalization, of Davos, or all this, is the world of the U.S. Navy. Because the U.S. Navy has for decades patrolled the sea lines of the international sea lines of communication, the maritime choke points, etc. And that's the key to a lot that follows. And that key is being lost. It's getting rusty. Because an aircraft carrier with all the fighter jets on board costs $18 billion. Every single nuclear-powered submarine cost, I don't know, $6 billion. The prices keep changing. This is why the AUKUS Accord is such a big deal. You know, what's the big deal about 6 or 7 submarines? It's because each one costs $6 billion or so, and a submarine is a moving underwater intelligence factory, able to scoop up, you know, telephone conversations onshore with just, you know, a few antennas. A destroyer, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, almost the same cost. Navies are expensive, and for many decades, the United States had a very vibrant, united middle class that funded and built the Navy with no questions asked. That middle class over the years has been splitting apart. Globalization has divided the United States into a whiskey-sipping, international, globalized, upper middle class, cosmopolitan, and a lower middle class, which is increasingly embittered. And anyway, you see the results in the very division of the very political divisiveness in the country today. So the United States is producing less carriers, which we could argue about, may be a good thing, but is producing less nuclear powered submarines. There's a big question whether it can even build enough submarines to be able to transfer some of them to Australia under the AUKUS Accords, less destroyers. It's becoming harder and harder to fund a Navy. And you know, the US Navy had, I think at latest count, about 280 warships. A US Navy with 230 warships, say, would be a different world. It would be a much more violent world where there would be more wars, etc. These things that sound like dull statistics, but they really matter. You know, I talked about days and weeks going by and decades happening. That's true in Ukraine and the Middle East. As you know, it's not true in Asia. Asia's had a steady, gradual military buildup from Japan south to Australia over the past 25 years. It's become increasingly militarized, and whereas the wars in Gaza and Ukraine have made news, they've caused arguments among us, they have not affected our bank accounts. You know, if you look at your retirement savings, you can see how financial markets have very efficiently priced in these wars. But one war they could not price in is a war in the Western Pacific between the United States and China. A high-end military conflict between the United States and China would have a devastating effect on world financial markets to an extent where the public would wipe out of their minds what's going on in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and would just be obsessed with what's going on in Taiwan and the adjacent South China Sea. And I would argue that, you know, this is, again, where tragedy is relevant, where Greek tragedy is relevant. Because what kept the peace in Europe during the Cold War? What really kept the peace? It was something unspoken. It was the fear of hydrogen bombs. That's why the Cold War was fought militarily on the periphery, in former Portuguese Southern Africa, in the Korean Peninsula, in Vietnam, and other places. There was no fighting in Europe, because both sides were terrified of it going nuclear. And I would argue that what keeps the peace in Asia, and will continue to keep the peace in Asia, is a very tragic sensibility, felt not just by the West, but by the Chinese too, who need to sell their goods to a vibrant American economy. A fear that if there was ever a military conflict, it would be almost an extinction level event for financial markets. It would be so devastating and worse than COVID, and Federal Reserves would not have easy answers for it. That's what keeps the peace. It's the peace of fear. It's the fear of something worse happening. And as long as that fear exists, there will be peace. Let me just say two other things in conclusion. We live at a time when all the great powers are weakening, all of them. America, whatever happens next Tuesday, is a divided country. At the end of World War II, America accounted for half of the world's manufacturing capacity. It's now down to about 15%, and China is ahead. Russia, as I explained, though it may be doing well temporarily in Ukraine, is a weakening empire. And China, hundreds of billions of dollars are fleeing the country. China's economic problems are immense. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd had famously said that Xi Jinping is destroying the golden goose that created the Chinese economic miracle in the first place. So, because China's an autocracy, its problems in decline are hidden somewhat, whereas America's are out in the open. But I would say that all three great powers are weakening, and we face a much more tumultuous world. Let me end up with a plea to use your imagination. There was a character in Tolstoy's War and Peace, towards the end of the book, Count Rasputchin. And Count Rasputchin was able to analyze the probability of Napoleon conquering Moscow in 1812 and how Moscow would be destroyed as a consequence. He knew this analytically, but he couldn't actually imagine it happening. So when it did happen in the book, he was as terrified and surprised as anyone, because it wasn't enough to be analytical. You also had to use your imagination. Throughout the 1970s, American experts warned about the Shah of Iran's weakening support at home, that it was an increasingly disliked regime. But nobody could actually imagine an Iran without the Shah. The Shah was eternal. How can there be an Iran without the Shah? Well, now we've had an Iran of the Ayatollahs for 45 years. And so nobody can imagine an Iran beyond the clerical regime. All we can imagine is an Iran that's in a clerical regime that wants to destroy Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And so I plead with you, use your imagination. There will be a future Iran, and there will be other great changes. And use your imagination about what could befall Asia if it loses its fear of financial catastrophe. It's, using your imagination is what the Greeks recommended when they warned of irrationality on the other side of rationality. That imagination is the ultimate protector. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you very, very much for that. I'll give you a moment to maybe gather your thoughts and give you some water.
Thank you.
The format for the remainder of this evening, I'm going to maybe explore some of the issues that Robert has raised in the last 45 minutes. But then I'd like to turn, and we will have I think what should be a pretty extended Q&A session from the audience. And we have a number of mics. We've got 4 mics. 2 on each side, low and high. And so as we move through that, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, etc. You've talked about a lot about tragedy, and clearly, a well-read leader can be familiar with tragedy in sort of antiquity, in the literary world of Shakespeare. They can read Machiavelli, Hobbes, and others. Is that enough, or do they really have to encounter and have had a lived experience of tragedy?
Yeah, I think your question leads to something that I agree with. Reading is not enough. It's a matter of lived life experience. Harry Truman came to the White House in 1945 in April with not knowing much about foreign affairs and not being a genius in any way. But he had fought in World War I. He had seen war firsthand, and he knew about tough decisions. And he turned out to be a very consequential great president because he had lived experience. Let me give you an example. John Kennedy, President Kennedy, was a genuine war hero from World War II. He was always engaged in foreign affairs. And presidential assassinations are really tragic events because had Kennedy not been assassinated, I would argue with anyone that America would not have sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam. Johnson had a lot of experience growing up poor in Texas, in southwest Texas, but he had no experience with international affairs. Whereas Kennedy grew up with it. His father was a failed ambassador to Britain at during the Hitler period up until the outbreak of World War II, when he had to be replaced and was humiliated. All of this Kennedy inculcated, and which made him wise in a way that Johnson was not.
But not all political assassinations are through the rifle. I mean, John Kerry, a war hero, somebody who had seen firsthand, assassinated, in an election campaign in a way that potentially could have changed history. We haven't had the last American president to have served, Bush 1.
And Bush 1 was not only the last American to have served, he was the last American aristocrat to be president of the United States. He was a de facto ambassador to China right after Nixon and Kissinger went there. He ran the CIA, all for short periods of time, admitted, but he had experience. And I think Bush 1, together with Baker as Secretary of State and Scowcroft as National Security Advisor, and I would argue Dick Cheney as an excellent defense secretary at the time, was probably the best functioning high-level national security team the U.S. has had in decades.
Part of that was Baker's famous quote about democracy is not for everyone. And to some extent, they seem to understand that whatever the attractiveness of the universality of democracy, the pragmatic reality, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, meant that they saw it as something that would come perhaps with time with an emerging middle class, but which they felt otherwise would be premature.
They also recognize the very diversity of the world. Many people who argue fervently for democracy and only democracy tend to be European focused. They tend to be Europeanists, European experts, because you get a different perspective in the Middle East. You get a different perspective in South Korea. How did South Korea is a successful democracy, but its middle class was built by a military autocracy.
As you look out across the leadership, and we've come to the end of that generation of leaders who were shaped by the post-war and the war era within Russia, those that had survived the Stalinist purges, etc. What's the prognosis globally for leadership at the moment?
I think if you go around the world, we have, a very dangerous decline of leadership in the former Soviet Union, Russia. As I explained during the week, but I'll repeat it now, the people who ruled the Soviet Union were all survivors of Stalin's purges, which meant that they were all extremely cautious. And they learned how never to have an opinion on anything, essentially. And when they did something that wasn't cautious, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were rejected from leadership 2 years later, Khrushchev. And so we've seen the decline in the Soviet Union. I think we've seen the decline in China. From Deng Xiaoping's Mandarinate, pragmatic, very subtle form of rule. He was like a Burkean conservative, you know. He knew that he had to introduce a high degree of capitalism in the society, but you couldn't do that by opening up the system politically. It had to stay autocratic. So you had Deng Xiaoping and his acolytes, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, but now we have a Leninist autocrat. And because of this Leninist autocrat, I think it's because of Xi that there's AUKUS in the first place. AUKUS might not have even been necessary, if had there just been a continuation of Deng-like rulers. And the Middle East has some I would argue that MBS, the Arabian Peninsula sultanates are more or less wise leaders. I think Egypt has a dead-end dictatorship. It's not going anywhere. It's more repressive than Mubarak. We'll see what happens in Tunisia. I would say Netanyahu, like him or not, he's a world historical figure because he's been in power 15 years in a very tumultuous democracy and has to make decisions of the kind I just spoke about at the beginning. Just decisions where there are no good answers.
You talked about the fact that the Ukraine, the Middle East are very, very different conflicts. The potential for contagion, the potential to create decades of changes within days, and you've said that's not what's going to happen in Taiwan. That the repercussions, the connectivity of global financial systems.
Well, I hope.
People's 401ks. What's the appetite, do you think, for the US to come, the Seventh Fleet to come to the defense? Will it depend on the nature of the conflict, or can we assume?
Donald Trump made a very crude statement. And you say, well, that's not news. He makes crude statements all the time. But listen to this. They told him that Taiwan's defense budget was very low, as a factor of GDP. And he said, the United States is like an insurance company. You don't pay the premiums, we don't defend you. And that's, that was Trumpian statesmanship. But there's an element of truth in that, which is that Taiwan, for the American public to support Taiwan, Taiwan has to be seen as willing to defend itself and making the sacrifices to do so. But again, a lot depends on the way in which there might be a crisis. If it's just a frontal Chinese invasion, I think the United States would immediately come to Taiwan's defense. But if it's something more subtle that evolves over time, where you have a combination of Taiwan, not putting more money into its defense budget, information warfare against Taiwan from the mainland to weaken support in Taiwan as a form of psychological warfare, it could be different. But that's the big question.
In terms of the US and its allies have spent 20 years in a conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a generation of Americans who have served, Australian forces have served. We would expect that within that inventory of young men and women that had first-hand experience, that what would emerge from that is leadership. Do you think that, in the same way that the Second World War brought forward an amazing generation of leaders, do you think that's going to come through? You've talked about in Imperial Grunts about, flyover states, working class young men and women serving, and yet 20 years later, with the exception of Pete Buttigieg, there really isn't, we haven't seen in Congress.
Yeah.
Vance, perhaps?
Actually, we have seen many individual examples of former soldiers and officers, who have gone into politics and have done well and are very thoughtful and all. I'm doing a book about China experts now, a long-range book project on China experts in America going back 100 years. And one of the modern ones I'm doing is someone who's a big China expert, former Marine in Iraq, and that's not too uncommon. But generally speaking, I was an embedded reporter with the Marines in the first Battle of Fallujah in April 2004, and I went back to Iraq several times during the war. And as you said, as you indicated, most of the people I was with, most non-commissioned officers were working class from flyover states or flyover counties. I would imagine strongly, though I haven't kept up with most of them, that they've all become Trump supporters. And I say this because that's what the statistics show. And it's explained by the fact when they went to war in 2003, they were actually very idealistic about it. They thought our leaders said we're going to change the Middle East in a positive way. And when it didn't happen, and when the Washington political class didn't pay a price in any demonstrable way, they became Trump supporters, I would say. But I still hold out the possibility that we will see future leaders, not necessarily presidents, but senators, congressmen we have, who have, who are veterans of Middle East conflicts and who have done well.
The ability of the political system, John Howard wrote a number of weeks ago about how challenging it is for talented, experienced, capable leadership to rise up through the political selection processes. You've talked about the contrast between the era of print and typewriter and the limited characters of Twitter and social media. Is that something that will in time they'll be able to navigate through? J.D. Vance has clearly been able to do it. But is it an obstacle to bringing the quality that we need in our leadership, not just in the US, but here and in the UK?
Yeah, see, what worries me, as I've said, is if you look at the history of the United States as a mass democracy, it basically thrived during the print and typewriter age, when everyone got their news from major news organs that were fact-checked, professionalized, long articles and essays where people had to delve into the complexity of issues. And that basically developed a very informed, moderate thinking electorate of either the center-right, which made them Republicans, like Bush and Baker, the elder Bush and Jim Baker, or center-left, kind of people. But now the United States and the rest of the world is in what I call a cyber digital age, which does not reward lengthy, moderate, complex thinking, but rewards impulse, instinct, extremism, emotion, passion, all in short bursts. And that leads to a different media climate. And the different media climate, it has its effect on leadership. Because all leaders want to be popular. Looking at what the press is saying about you is not new. It goes back many decades. It's just with the media changing and becoming more superficialized and entertainment oriented, it has its corrosive effects on institutions and leadership.
Last question before I go to the audience. Next week, decades and days, or?
I don't know. And I'm not trying to dodge the question. The polls are on a hair's breadth difference. Nobody in recent days has seemed to be drifting to an advantage, even of a 1 or 2 or 3 point level. The polls admit that they have a 3-point margin of error, so that anything can happen, including a decisive victory by one or the other, where you would have an early evening. Because with 6 or 7 swing states, a percentage apart, if one candidate actually gets a 2.5% advantage, he could run the table on all the electoral college swing states. And that could happen very early in the evening if the polls were not wrong, but just a little bit inaccurate, kind of. I think the key thing is that whoever wins half of the country, or nearly half of it, is going to feel disenfranchised, because we no longer have a center-right versus a center-left. We have a far-right versus a more progressive further left. And so because the two parties are further apart philosophically, each party has no regard for the other, which didn't used to be the case. Remember, when Nixon lost to Kennedy, Kennedy won the election by 118,000 votes out of like 50 million cast. He made a joke about it. He said, they asked him about it. He said, well, my father said he'd pay for a victory, not for a landslide. Kennedy was able to make jokes about all this. But anyway, and yet Nixon, who is the vice president, certified the election and refused to challenge it. Because again, the two sides were closer than they are now.
A man who was born in a house that his father built, the opening line of his biography, Nixon. Questions from the floor. Just, we would ask you, keep your questions brief, that way we can get through more questions. We've got 4 mics. We've got Lottie, Eric is here, Megan's here, and we've got Jack. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand, wait for the mic to arrive, and then you can pose your question loud and clear. So Jack, we might start here in the front row, and then I think we're going to go to Charles behind this person.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry to mention American politics. I think that's on everyone's mind. Do you think, in terms of the long-term future of the Republicans, the leadership of Trump is aberrational, and after he goes off the scene, it will just go back to, say, being run by the George Bush, Marco Rubio types? Or is this a permanent feature, the disruptive sort of extremism?
The character of Trump is aberrational. Because even his running mate, J.D. Vance, is normal in a way that Trump is not normal. Whatever you may think about J.D. Vance's politics. So the character of Trump is aberrational. However, what's not aberrational is that the Republican Party has moved from the center-right to the further right. And so it will never again be George H.W. Bush's party again.
Charles here, Jack, just thank you.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. An obvious question from this audience is, okay, well, what are the implications for Australia? I mean, what's an optimal strategy for us when we're facing these issues?
What's the optimal strategy for Australia?
Yes, see, Australia's dilemma is partially geographical. It's a big continent. But it has only, 30 million people? Is that the population? Yeah, it has roughly 30 million people tucked into its southeast corner. So it cannot defend the vast area around it. It requires the help of the US Navy and the Air Force combined, which means naval power, in an era when you have a Leninist autocrat ruling China. So I think that for decades, Australia was able to get rich off China and to be protected by the United States Navy and Air Force. That was held true during Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. It's less so now. It's more like you've had to make a choice. And I think AUKUS was the choice because nuclear submarines, I can tell you from experience, because I was embedded on several for weeks at a time, are the most complex, massive technological beasts you can imagine, all run by nuclear power, which is so amazing that you could take a hot shower for 30 minutes and so could half the rest of the crew, and their lights are still on, the computers are still working. The power is just endless. So I think AUKUS was the jump into the US side, but this presupposes that the US will always be reliable. Will always be rational, will always be reliable. And I frankly worry about this being the case, if Trump is elected, because Vice President Harris, frankly, she'll be a committee-driven mediocrity, but that's safe. She will have the best top people working for her. Not just at the Secretary of State and Defense level, but at the Assistant Secretary, the Deputy Assistant Secretary. Let me tell you from experience, the Democratic Party is just filled with the most competent, dedicated technocrats in the national security field who are just ready to move into government, to either replace the Biden administration or to extend it or whatever, that Australia would have nothing much to worry about. But I just worry about Trump. I hope I'm not being too fearful.
Question? I'm going to go here, and then I'll go here, and then we'll come over this side. So this row here, and then I'll come to Madam here.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You've spoken about world events very much from a realpolitik point of view, without really considering any moral dimension to any of the various conflicts around the world. The supposed repository of morality is the supranational organisation, the United Nations, and yet that seems to be more fragmented and less highly regarded around the world than ever. Would you like to comment on?
Yes. The UN engaged people's idealism and imagination in the early Cold War. Because remember, the Soviet Union was one of the victorious Allied powers of that war and was not engaged in a direct conflict with the United States, so that the Security Council meant something. And in the early Cold War, the Security Council accurately reflected the division of power in the world. But decades hence, where we are now, you have France as a member, India is not. You have a war, you essentially have the United States at war with Russia in Ukraine, though indirectly. The United States is doing all it can to bodily weaken a rival power, both the US and Russia, both being at the same time members of the Security Council. When you look at Gaza, when you look at Ukraine, the UN has nothing to say in all of this. It is a world of power, and the Greeks understood this, but they also understood the limits of power and the need for morality in the Melian dialogue, where the Athenians butchered the inhabitants of the island of Milos because they were weak and couldn't do anything about it. And that was the beginning of the end of the Athenian Golden Age. So morality matters, but in a world of power, morality has to follow power, or to be integrated with it. You cannot have a pure world without taking into account power. I'll give you an example. During the 1990s, the intellectual world was focused and moral world was focused on the crimes of the Balkans. But there were equal crimes going on in Chechnya, in 2 wars in Chechnya, where all these moralists and intellectuals had very little to say about it. That's because Russia completely dominated the region with atomic bombs. That was not the case in the Western Balkans, where it was minor powers who were not nuclear armed. So morality can have an effect in the Balkans where it could not in Chechnya, because there was an issue of power involved that morality had no answer for.
Lady here, Jack, and then we have a question here. We'll go to Simon. Erica, if you can go to Simon.
And thank you very much for your presentation. It's an honour. This ageing demographics and the all-encompassing problems, not just economical, labour, et cetera, that you touched on. You talked about the Africans and the European 7-to-1 birth rate. Out of interest, is that represent an increase in African and a decrease of European? And if so, why? Now, this question comes really, I'm not a political person or educated, it really comes from a common sense, but I also read in the paper that the South Koreans are doing it. Instead of forcing the Europeans and the Western world women to have children the J.D. Vance way, the suppression of women, you do see countries now, and South Korea is now doing it. Why are they not just doing the simple supporting the costs of women? I mean, most women will say in the Western world, it's cost. So I'm not saying this from a leftist political, I'm just saying it from a sensible, that if you were cradle to grave support the cost of women having children, you'd probably double it over. You know, most young women in their 20s say, yeah, I'll have 2, I'll have 3, but we can't afford it. And just a little comment question on following on from the gentleman about the morality. You did talk about the sort of like the, I think the word was you used efficient for some autocracies, and you used Saudi Arabia as an example. And my question.
So let's take 2 questions. The question of declining birth rates in the West versus and the relevance of geography, the geographical overlay of that. Why are governments, why aren't there more effective policies around that? And then the second question is about kind of universal values in the Arabian Peninsula and the long term. Does it need perhaps a middle class that will drive change?
Yeah. Having children is a very personal choice. And it's more likely to happen when people are in better financial circumstances. I mean, that's just a fact, So if you want people to, if you want the population to grow, you have to provide social services or tax incentives or a combination of the two, or else people will make private life choices not to have children or to have fewer of them, and that's absolutely essential. The Arabian Peninsula has a vibrant middle class, generated by oil and gas wealth, to be sure, but nevertheless a vibrant middle class that essentially cares about predictability and safety and convenience. It's very convenient. It's a very convenience-driven world. You could see it in Saudi. I was in Saudi Arabia during COVID, and you could go anywhere for a test and get a result within an hour. There was no bureaucracy involved in it. And you got like an app on your phone to show that you were vaccinated, and you flashed it whenever you entered a restaurant or a mall or something. They had figured it out. That's the kind of things that impress people. In the United States, we never figured it out. COVID was a mess, though there was variations from state to state, and county to county. It's a philosophical question. The Western elites are obsessed with democracy and human rights, but elites in other parts of the world outside of Greater Europe and the West, I'm getting the feeling, may be obsessed with convenience. You know, just don't bother me and I won't bother you, and make things convenient for me.
They've also seen the evidence of the Arab Spring and the chaos.
That's true.
Let's go to Simon. Erica, Simon.
Thank you. Terrific talk. Thank you. Can I take you back to what you were saying at the beginning about tragedy and the idea of tragedy as a clash of good versus good? And you mentioned Oedipus, and you talked about Iphigenia in Aulis, and think about Antigone as the clash between the good that is duty to the state and the good that is duty to the gods, and tragedy in general as Athens thinking about clashes of goods and clashes of values and a way of processing those clashes for itself. And then can we map that onto what you're saying, onto contemporary America? And could you think for us a little bit aloud about the clashes of goods that you see either immediately now or in the recent past, or even going back to Kennedy and Nixon that you've been talking about very interestingly, and bring out what that equivalent clash of values or clash of goods would be in the American context compared with the Athenian one? Yeah,
I think I understand the question. America became a democracy in the 1780s after the Constitution was promulgated. But it had to fight a civil war to give a big chunk of the population their rights, their democratic rights. And then those democratic rights still weren't available until 1964 in the Civil Rights Act. So having a brilliant constitution was not enough. There was a war, and there was policy changes almost into 200 years later. It was a gradual process, and a lot of it was based on self-interest, and all of that. So America had to find its way towards a wider democratic franchise, so to speak. The democracy itself was not enough. It had to go wider, and it had to do with, with political self-interest of the southern states, and all of that. And I would argue that these are all the kinds of compromises and difficulties and imperfections that the Greeks entertained in their worldview.
I'm going to go to Michael in a moment, and I hope you don't mind. Can I take you to Balkan Ghosts and a Saturday? And a Saturday in which tragedy was writ large in what was a modern European era in Srebrenica. To Simon's question, is that the outcome?
What?
In terms of the Dutch forces withdrawing, peacekeeping forces withdrawing from Srebrenica. I mean, for you personally, you had sort of written about this in advance.
Yeah.
Clinton read the book, and it led. Your reflections on that and those tragedies?
Yeah. My reflections are that when the Balkans erupted in violence, George H.W. Bush was president, and the first Secretary of State to deal with it was James Baker. And Baker said we should do nothing, because we've been lectured by the Europeans throughout the Cold War how they could settle their own problems if we would just get off their backs. If the U.S. would withdraw, if the Soviets would withdraw, Europe would be fine. And this was the first crisis immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Baker said, let's give the Europeans a chance. Let's see what they can do on their own. Well, you saw the results. Exactly. Because, there's an irony about peacekeeping. If you're not willing to kill and take power, you won't be a good peacekeeper. Because peacekeeping, like war making, is about monopolizing the use of force in your area and being willing to fight for it. The Dutch peacekeepers were not. They had no interest in monopolizing the use, the use of force in their area, and they were eaten alive through naivete, etc. There's a rough comparison with UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. Which has been around since the late 1970s, Operation Litani in 1978. And Hezbollah it was invented and grew up around UNIFIL. And though there wasn't a singular event like with the Dutch in Srebrenica, it was a similar policy. If you're not sending troops there willing to fight and kill, they're not going to be very good peacekeepers. And when NATO went in, it monopolized the use of force. And Baker would say that Europe failed the test. It required NATO, which is not a democratic organization, which is led by the United States.
Michael.
Robert, a great lecture. Do young Americans believe in America? I asked the question in the context of the demonstration that have happened on university campuses, the rise of anti-Semitism. Is there a problem with the academy? And what lesson do you draw out of the last 12 months that are relevant?
Yeah, I went to school in the late 1960s and early 1970s when university professors were all veterans of World War II. So they had life experience as well as academic experience, and this was reflected. I took courses, English literature courses, that you couldn't find on any Ivy League school campus today. Nobody would teach them because they would say, oh, it's just dead white males and all of that. Well, who else do you learn from except writers who are dead? Because by writers who are dead are writing about a time you have not personally experienced, so that you can add your understanding of what went on before you were born. So you should read dead writers. You know, I would make the argument. I think the academy has declined because you have people who have degrees but no life experience. And there's something to be said about the tyranny of virtue. You know, everyone trying to be so virtuous that they create a tyranny out of it, a kind of abstract tyranny out of it. And that's what forms the framework for what we've seen on university campuses, setting aside the fact that there's a real human tragedy going on. You know, it's perfectly understandable that people would demonstrate against human rights violations in Gaza, you know, because the Israelis have taken to put it mildly, extremely harsh actions. But leaving that aside, there's no maturity in the outlook because you're dealing with people who have been physically pampered their whole lives, grew up with financial security, with physical security. So it's very hard for them to understand peoples and governments who have lived without physical security and often without financial security either.
Question at the back. I've neglected this person's apologies. So Megan, and then I'll go to Erica.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, just going back to some of these wars. So the US is involved in Ukraine and they're supporting Israel, and it's very costly without putting troops on the ground yet.
Could you speak up? Sorry, it's quite hard to hear.
No worries. So I was just saying that the US is involved in these wars, which is costing them a lot of money at least. So there's two spheres, and then possibly sometime in the next decade there could be another sphere in Taiwan. So my question is, can the US really, well, they can defend Taiwan, but how much is that going to cost them? And then the second part is that cost worth that thing to the US? Is it a vital interest to the US? Yeah. Because also from an Australian perspective, is it a vital interest to us as well?
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, there is actually a very interesting debate going on now in Washington, in defense circles, about whether the U.S. can continue to arm Ukraine and Taiwan. It gets down to the nitty-gritty. You have these policy analysts arguing about the numbers of shells, the numbers of munition shells. And though it gets very technical, it's also very interesting because they're dealing with inescapable realities. That what's called the defense industrial base, The amount of bullets and shells and others cannot fight two wars at the same time. Then the counter-argument is, well, fine, we'll just expand the defense industrial base. The U.S. Defense budget is still low compared to GDP than that of many other countries. It's higher than that in Europe, most of Europe, but it's lower than other countries. And the U.S. can easily afford to expand its industrial base in order to defend both Taiwan and Ukraine. But it's the very fact and fervency of this debate that's going on that has very little to do actually with isolationism or anything like that. Is can we afford to keep doing what we're doing? And the counter argument to that is whatever it costs, it's more peaceful than getting into a war with China and Taiwan. So you're better off building up deterrence, a deterrence value, which is a very good argument. But what it shows is that ultimately the American public is not 100% sold on defending Ukraine or maybe even Taiwan.
Erica, question here.
Cheers. I just have a question around, you were talking about the three predominant powers in the world all kind of falling at a similar, I didn't think you specified rate, but they were all falling. Ironically, two would have to hit the floor first, right? Of those three, you've got Russia with potential ethnic tensions, as you outlined, China with the fastest aging population in the world, over-leveraged broadly across the economy, and the United States with a divisive political system. Out of those three, I think my personal interpretation is the United States is still the best off. It'd be good to hear how you view those challenges.
He thinks the U.S. is the best off?
Well, in a world of declining great powers,
one thing that
who holds their breath longer?
Yeah, one thing I'll argue about in a book I have coming out in January is that decline itself is overrated, because the British Royal Navy started to decline in the 1890s, but that did not stop Britain from essentially saving the world in 1940. Which is almost a half a century later. So decline can be so gradual that it's more academic than practical. Also, the three powers are not declining at the same rate and in the same way. So that I think of the three, I would hold up better hope for the United States than for Russia or China, because I think their problems are much, much more profound and get down to the very system itself. Whereas the US system is capable of regeneration, it's done so a number of times in the past.
Final question from me. You've made the case in the past for cold-hearted analysis over passion. But yet tonight you talked about the fact that great leaders and power is often associated with a romantic outlook. Can you unpack the passion first and why passion in international affairs can be cloud judgment?
Yeah, all right, let me define romantic. Romantic is not falling in love. That's not what I mean by romantic. What I mean is romantic is agreeing that people are irrational, that they're given to passions, emotions, and that people matter. You just can't, human beings are not particles in a test tube. It's not all geopolitics and geography, it's Shakespearean. And and that's what I mean by a romantic outlook. And there has to be a degree of passion. But at the same time, what the Greeks would say is this world is beautiful, but it's imperfect, because ultimately your passion has to be tempered by practicality. And that leads to the hardest choices, the most difficult kinds of choices.
Robert, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you.